Imagine for a moment you're in the cockpit of a state-of-the-art fighter jet, engaged in a dogfight against unknown forces. Your heart pounds as you execute evasive maneuvers, the G-forces pressing against your chest. Suddenly, without warning, your entire world dissolves into blinding light. This is exactly what happened to elite soldier Marcus Thorne, snatched from his fighter in mid-combat by an energy net deployed from a vessel unlike anything humanity had ever seen. One moment he was defending Earth's skies, the next he was a prisoner aboard an alien ship, his fate completely unknown. When Marcus awakens, he finds himself trapped within a crystalline containment field, his every movement monitored by three slender, silver-skinned beings who observe him with a mixture of scientific curiosity and visible apprehension. These are the Xylosians, advanced extraterrestrials whose technology surpasses anything humans have developed. Their leader speaks words that send chills through the air. The specimen is secured, though the conclave doubts this wisdom. In that moment, Marcus realizes he is not just a prisoner, he is an experiment, a subject of study for a civilization that clearly fears what he represents. What could make an advanced alien species capable of crossing interstellar space and capturing a human from a moving fighter jet express doubt and apprehension about their own actions? Why would beings with such overwhelming technological superiority show visible unease when faced with one lone human soldier? The answers to these questions form the heart of a story that challenges everything we think we know about humanity's place in the cosmos. This isn't just another alien encounter tale. It's a revelation about the unique qualities that make humans extraordinary, even to civilizations that have mastered technologies we can barely imagine. As we explore this extraordinary narrative together, you'll discover why the Xylosians captured Marcus Thorne, what they hoped to learn from him, and most importantly, why they quickly realized they might have made a terrible mistake. This journey will take us into the depths of alien psychology, human resilience, and the unexpected moment when the captors become the fearful ones. Stay with me, because what unfolds is not just a story of science fiction, but a reflection of humanity's most profound strengths that might one day determine our survival among the stars. The sterile, humming chamber offered no comfort, no familiar reference points. Marcus Thorne remained motionless within the shimmering energy field, his military-trained eyes cataloging every detail of his captors. The three Xylosians, their elongated silver forms moving with an unsettling grace, communicated in soft, melodic tones that his translator implant struggled to fully decipher. He caught words like baseline assessment and psionic resonance, but the true meaning became horrifyingly clear when one of them approached with a complex, crystalline device that pulsed with a faint internal light. Without ceremony or warning, a searing, white-hot pain erupted inside Marcus's skull, a violation far deeper than any physical torture. This was a psionic probe, an attempt to rifle through his memories, his knowledge, his very consciousness. But the Xylosians had made a critical and nearly fatal error in their assumptions. They had captured a warrior, yes, but one forged in the most secretive crucibles of Earth's defense forces. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a pilot, he was a product of Project Aegis, a black-budget initiative that hardened soldiers against psychic warfare through brutal, relentless mental conditioning. His mind was a fortress layered with psychic deadfalls, mantras of focus, and reflexive counter-assault protocols. The alien probe, expecting the soft, undefended thoughts of a primitive, instead slammed into a disciplined neurological battlement. The pain Marcus felt was immense, but it was nothing compared to the violent feedback surge that rocketed back along the psionic link. A sound like a high-voltage cable snapping filled the room. The Xylosian operating the device recoiled as if physically struck, a guttural, choking cry escaping its lipless mouth. The intricate crystalline tool shattered in its grasp, and the alien stumbled backward, clutching its smooth silver head. Thin trails of iridescent fluid seeped from its nostrils and the corners of its large black eyes. The other two Xylosians froze, their previously calm demeanor shattered into pure, unadulterated shock. The lead interrogator, its body trembling, managed to focus its pained gaze on Marcus. The words it gasped were not translated through any device. They were a raw, psionic emission of sheer terror and disbelief that echoed directly in Marcus's mind. "What are you?" In that electrifying moment, Marcus understood. Their technology, their superior attitude, it was a facade. They were afraid, and a soldier knows to press the advantage when he sees fear in his enemy's eyes. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face, a stark contrast to the alien's distress. He met the creature's pained gaze, his voice a low, steady growl that cut through the chamber's humming silence. "Your worst damn mistake." As he spoke, he saw the subtle, unpredictable flicker in the ambient light panels surrounding his containment field. The holographic displays stuttered. The low hum of the ship's systems wavered for a fraction of a second, as if his very presence, his defiant human will, was causing a fundamental instability in their impossibly advanced technology. The tension in the chamber was a physical force thick enough to taste. Marcus held the lead Xylosian's pained gaze, the alien's silent terror echoing in his mind. He could feel the ship itself reacting to his presence, a subtle but undeniable dissonance in the hum of the machinery that surrounded them. The two other aliens had rushed to their injured comrade's side, their long, delicate fingers fluttering over his silver skin as they tried to stem the flow of iridescent fluid. They spoke in hushed, frantic tones, their melodic language now sharp with alarm. They were scientists, he realized, not warriors. They were completely unprepared for a subject that fought back on a level they couldn't comprehend. While their attention was diverted, Marcus's training took over. His eyes scanned his immediate surroundings within the crystalline containment field, searching for any weakness, any potential tool. His bindings were energy-based, but the console that controlled his prison was only a few feet away, a smooth, dark panel covered in softly glowing alien glyphs. The Xylosians, in their panic, had left it unguarded. With a surge of desperate strength, Marcus shifted his weight, stretching his bound hands toward the panel. His fingers, numb from the energy restraints, brushed against the cool, glassy surface. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The entire panel lit up with a brilliant white light, so intense it forced Marcus to squint. A series of complex, geometric symbols flashed across the screen at an incredible speed before resolving into a single line of alien script. A clear, synthesized voice, utterly different from the Xylosians' melodic tones, echoed through the chamber in a language he had never heard, yet somehow understood perfectly. It announced genetic sequencing complete, Terran Prime signature confirmed, authorization granted. The effect on the Xylosians was nothing short of catastrophic. The injured one slumped to the floor, forgotten. The other two recoiled as if Marcus had transformed into a star itself. Their large black eyes widened in abject, soul-shaking horror. Their slender bodies trembled violently. One of them let out a low, keening wail of pure despair. The leader, the one who had spoken of doubt, slowly raised a shaking hand to point at the screen, then at Marcus. Its voice was not the confident tone of a scientist anymore, but the terrified whisper of a child realizing a monster from its bedtime stories is real. The Progenitors, it breathed, the word dripping with ancient fear and reverence. Their return was not prophecy, it was a warning. As if its words were a command, the entire ship erupted into chaos. The calm, ambient blue lighting vanished, replaced by a strobing, frantic crimson that painted the silver walls in bloody hues. A deafening, pulsing klaxon blared, a sound of pure, institutional panic. Holographic displays all around the chamber flickered to life, displaying urgent security alerts and scrolling data streams in the alien script. The Xylosians were no longer looking at a captured specimen. They were staring at a ghost, a myth made flesh, and their entire civilization was screaming in response. Marcus Thorne, a soldier from Earth, had just been identified as the heir to a legacy so terrifying it sent an advanced alien race into a full-scale emergency lockdown. The lead Xylosian, its voice reduced to a trembling whisper, gestured toward the central console. The frantic red alarms dimmed, replaced by a soft, golden light that coalesced into a breathtakingly intricate holographic display. "You must see," it urged, its fear now laced with a desperate, almost religious urgency. "You must understand what your touch has awakened in our systems." The archives, they have not been accessed in millennia. With a wave of its slender hand, the room dissolved around Marcus. He was no longer in a sterile chamber. He stood, or rather his consciousness was projected, onto the surface of a primordial world. Towering, impossible figures clad in gleaming environmental suits that echoed human form moved across a volcanic landscape. They wielded devices that pulsed with familiar energy, the same energy he'd felt from his own fighters' systems, but magnified 1,000-fold. With deliberate, godlike motions, they directed massive orbital mirrors, seeded the acidic oceans with tailored microorganisms, and sculpted entire mountain ranges with precise tectonic charges. The world transformed before his eyes, from a hellscape to a verdant paradise in what felt like moments. A symbol was emblazoned on the shoulder of one suited figure, a stylized helix encircled by a star, the same symbol that had flashed on the console when it identified him. The scene shifted again and again. He watched the same figures, the Progenitors, performing this act of cosmic creation on 100 different worlds. A frozen ball of ice was thawed and given a thick, breathable atmosphere. A desolate desert planet was gifted with vast underground aquifers and genetically engineered forests. Each time, the world was left teeming with new, unique life, a living sculpture signed by its human architects. The scale was incomprehensible, a history of galactic gardening that made every human achievement seem like child's play. The final projection stabilized. It showed a world of lush, silver jungles and floating landmasses. The progenitors were there, but their work was different. They were not terraforming. They were in a vast laboratory, and on crystalline slabs before them lay the delicate, embryonic forms of the Xylosians themselves. Marcus watched, his breath catching in his throat, as the ancient humans meticulously refined their genetic code, bestowing upon them their slender forms, their advanced intellect, and their innate psionic sensitivity. They were not just engineers of worlds, they were the creators of life, the architects of species. The hologram faded, returning Marcus to the containment chamber. The silence was heavier than before, thick with the weight of eons. The Xylosian commander looked at him, its large black eyes now filled with a terrifying mix of awe and existential dread. "You see now, Terran," it said, its voice hollow. "Your ancestors did not merely explore the stars, they built them. They engineered life throughout this entire sector. They are the reason this galaxy lives and breathes." It gestured weakly to itself and its recovering comrades, including us. "We are not just another race you encountered. We are your children." The pieces clicked into place with the force of a tectonic shift, the psionic resonance, the ship's systems recognizing his genetic signature and granting him access. Their technology didn't just respond to him, it obeyed him on a fundamental level. It was built on a science so advanced it was indistinguishable from magic, but its core programming, its very essence, was keyed to the genetic blueprint of its creators. Marcus Thorne, a soldier from Earth, wasn't a primitive specimen to these beings. He was a living relic, a direct descendant of the gods who had literally written their species into existence. Their fear wasn't of his combat skills or his mental defenses. It was the primal, terrifying fear of a creation suddenly standing before its creator, realizing the stories of their return were not myths, but a delayed chapter of their own history that had just begun. The chamber held its breath, The frantic red alarms had ceased, leaving only the soft hum of systems and the heavy silence of a shattered paradigm. Marcus Thorne stood within his containment field, the revelation of his ancestry coursing through him not as abstract knowledge, but as a deep, instinctual truth. He looked down at his own hands, seeing them not just as the tools of a soldier, but as the instruments of gods. The energy bindings around his wrists suddenly felt less like restraints and more like a misunderstanding of cosmic proportions. He didn't need to break them, he simply needed to remind the ship of its true master. He focused his will not as a command, but as a gentle assertion of fact. The bindings didn't snap or fizzle, they dissolved into harmless motes of light, acknowledging his sovereignty. The Xylosians watched paralyzed as he took a single, deliberate step forward onto the deck. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the chamber. He focused on the main entrance, a seamless part of the curved wall. With a thought as simple as deciding to breathe, the door ear-raised open without a sound, revealing the gleaming corridor beyond. He then turned his gaze to the harsh, sterile overhead lighting. Another effortless mental nudge, and the light softened to a warm, subdued glow, as if the ship itself was settling into a more comfortable, respectful stance in his presence. The lead Xylosian made a small, choked sound, a mixture of terror and reverence. Marcus turned his full attention to them, his military posture rigid, his expression transformed from that of a cornered animal to one of absolute, unassailable authority. The cold, predatory smile was gone, replaced by a look of profound and chilling disappointment. "You spent so long studying the stars you forgot who lit them," he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a weight that seemed to vibrate through the very metal of the floor. "You scanned my planet, analyzed our broadcasts, and saw a fractured, primitive species. You thought you were capturing a specimen. You believed you held the advantage." He paused, letting the silence amplify his next words. "You didn't capture me. I allowed this. I needed to see if your intentions were purely scientific curiosity, or if your people had deviated into the arrogance of conquerors. I needed to test you." The shift in his demeanor was absolute and terrifying. He was no longer their prisoner, their subject, or even a mysterious relic. He was a judge, an auditor from a forgotten age arriving to inspect the work of his forebears and assess the character of their creations. The Xylosians exchanged a series of panicked, silent glances, their large black eyes wide with the dawning horror of their miscalculation. They had not been the hunters in this encounter. They had been the examined, the tested, and in their fear and their use of a psionic probe, they had very likely already failed. The one who had spoken of doubt now looked upon Marcus not just as a progenitor, but as their jury and potential executioner. The lead Xylosian commander slowly, deliberately, lowered itself to its knees. The gesture was profoundly alien, a deep bow that pressed its silver forehead against the cool deck plating, its long limbs folding into a posture of absolute surrender. Its slender hands trembled as it reached into a fold of its shimmering tunic, withdrawing not a weapon, but a long, elegantly curved dagger forged from a single piece of obsidian that seemed to drink the light from the room. It held the blade across its open palms, offering it up to Marcus with an expression of pure, unvarnished desperation. "We beg forgiveness, Progenitor," it whispered, the words resonating with a psionic weight that conveyed more than just their literal meaning. They carried the collective fear of an entire civilization. "We saw only a savage, violent species on your world, broadcasting your conflicts and your divisions. We believed your kind had fallen too far from the grace of your ancestors to remember your purpose. We thought we could take what we needed by force and justify our transgression with our desperation." The commander's large, dark eyes glistened with a sheen of moisture. "Our species faces extinction. A biomechanical scourge we call the Devourer Plague has swept through our core systems. It does not kill in the conventional sense. It rewrites biology at a fundamental level, turning living beings into crystalline statues. their consciousness trapped forever in unfeeling prisons of their own transformed flesh. Our medical science, all our technology, is useless against it. It is a weapon designed to circumvent every defense we possess. He gestured weakly toward the holographic emitters that had moments ago shown the glory of the progenitors. The archives of our creators speak of a universal remedy, a master code hidden within the genetic legacy of the terraformers, a fail-safe designed to heal any corruption their creations might one day face. But the vault that holds this secret, it does not respond to our touch. It is keyed to a living Terran prime signature. We did not capture a specimen to dissect. We captured a key. You are the only being in the known galaxy who can activate the ancient healing archives and save our people from becoming a museum of our own corpses. The enormity of their gamble hung in the air. They had seen humanity's flaws, our wars, our pettiness, our apparent primitiveness, and assumed the mantle of the superior beings. They had believed they could harvest a solution from a people they considered little more than animals, never imagining that the very person they snatched from the sky would be the living heir to the architects of their species. Their abduction was not an act of malice, but one of pure, terrified survival, born from a catastrophic misreading of who and what humanity truly was. They hadn't just asked the wrong god for a miracle, they had tried to kidnap one, and now they knelt before him, offering their own ceremonial blade in a gesture of ultimate submission, hoping against hope that the god they had offended would be merciful. The obsidian blade remained on the floor between them, a stark symbol of their utter defeat and desperation. Marcus looked from the weapon to the prostrated form of the Xylosian commander, his mind processing the staggering confession. A plague of crystalline death, a desperate search for a genetic key. Their entire terrifying, invasive operation was born not from conquest, but from a last, frantic hope for survival. The irony was profound. In their fear of humanity's apparent savagery, they had committed the very act of violence they believed defined us. He did not pick up the blade. Instead, he took another step forward, his boots clicking softly on the deck. The ship's systems seemed to hum in a quieter, more attentive register awaiting his will. He looked down at the commander, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold, judicial calm. "Get up," he commanded, his voice devoid of anger but layered with an authority that brooked no argument. "We are not in an age of kneeling to gods. We are in an age of negotiation between species, and you are in no position to make demands." The alien slowly, shakily, rose to its full height, its large eyes fixed on Marcus, waiting for a judgment that would decide the fate of billions of its people. The other two Xylosians remained frozen, their fate hanging on his next words. "The fail-safe, this master code you seek, exists," Marcus stated, the certainty in his voice surprising even himself. It was an instinctual knowledge unlocked by the ship's archives and resonating deep within his DNA. My ancestors were meticulous, not cruel. They would not create life without also creating a means to preserve it. He paused, letting the glimmer of hope terrify them before he defined its cost. "You will have your cure, but not on your terms. You will have it on mine." He began to pace slowly, a predator outlining the boundaries of a new territory. "First, this ship will immediately set a course for Earth. You will return me to the exact coordinates from which I was taken, at the exact moment our engagement with your unknown forces was occurring. You will then deactivate whatever weaponry or stealth systems you employed and make your vessel completely visible to human detection systems. You will not attempt to erase the event from our records." The Xylosians exchanged horrified glances, revealing themselves submitting to a primitive military. It was a violation of every protocol they held. Marcus saw their hesitation and his eyes hardened. "Your secrecy is a luxury you can no longer afford. You do not get to harvest solutions from the dark and then disappear. Humanity will know it is not alone, and it will know the truth of its own history from me." Second, he continued, his tone leaving no room for debate. upon arrival, you will grant me full, unequivocal diplomatic authority to speak for your species. You will provide me with complete linguistic and cultural databases and open a direct, real-time communication channel to your ruling conclave. They will confirm, in terms clear to every human leader listening, that I am their appointed ambassador in this matter. There will be no ambiguity, no deceit. The conversation about your salvation will be a transparent one. The commander looked as if it might be sick. Handing such profound diplomatic power to a single, newly enlightened human was an unprecedented risk. Marcus was demanding they trust the very judgment they had so recently failed. Progenitor, the political complexities, the shock to your people, it stammered, are my people's concern, not yours. Marcus cut it off. You feared our violence and our division. Now you will have to trust our capacity for reason and mercy. Finally, he said, coming to a stop directly in front of the commander, understand this clearly. I am the key, but humanity is the lock. I will access your archive. I will retrieve this universal remedy, but I will not simply hand it over. I will present your case and your confession to the collective leadership of Earth. We will see the full extent of this devourer plague. We will verify your story, and then we will vote. The word hung in the air, simple and devastating. A vote. We, the species you considered primitive and savage, will collectively decide if yours deserves salvation. We will weigh your actions, your fear, your desperation, your attempt to psionically violate me and abduct one of our own against the value of billions of lives. Your fate will not be decided by a god from the past, but by the flawed, compassionate, and unpredictable conscience of the children you look down upon. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more threatening than any shout. You came for a key. You found a judge and a jury. Do you accept these terms? There was a long, agonizing silence. The commander looked at its comrades, seeing in their terrified faces a reflection of its own impossible choice. Certain extinction by plague, or potential salvation at the hands of a species they had profoundly misjudged and offended. The weight of their entire civilization rested on this single decision. Finally, its shoulders slumped in utter defeat. It placed a hand over its chest in a gesture of solemn oath. The conclave will protest, but we have no other path. We accept your terms, Progenitor. We place our fate in the hands of humanity. It was the most terrifying surrender in their species' history. The journey back to Earth was not conducted in the silence of victory, but in the heavy quiet of a lesson being learned. The Xylosian ship, now operating under Marcus's sovereign command, moved with a new purpose through the void. With the immediate crisis of judgment temporarily settled, a different kind of tension filled the air, one of profound, awkward re-evaluation. Marcus, no longer a prisoner but not yet an ally, used the transit time not to rest but to interrogate the very archives that had so terrified his captors. He accessed their observational data on Earth, and what he found was a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting an image that was both familiar and brutally alien. He summoned the lead science officer, the one who had first wielded the psionic probe. The being entered the chamber with a palpable sense of trepidation, its silver skin seeming to pale under the warm, respectful lighting Marcus had willed into existence. Marcus didn't look up from the main holographic display, which was scrolling through a chillingly comprehensive history of human conflict. He watched highlights from centuries of warfare, from the organized phalanxes of ancient Greece to the horrific, mechanized slaughter of the world wars, all neatly catalogued and analyzed by the Xylosians. Explain this, Marcus commanded, his voice flat, his finger pointing to a particularly graphic analysis of the siege of Stalingrad. The science officer flinched, its large eyes fixed on the display. It was our primary field of study, it began, its melodic voice subdued. For over 3 of your centuries, our long-range observation posts have monitored your planet's electromagnetic broadcast. At first, we listened for signs of progenitor awakening, for the spark of your true potential. but what we found, what dominated your airwaves, was conflict. The alien gestured weakly at the scrolling data. Your history is written in battle lines and territorial disputes. Your greatest technological leaps were almost invariably born from the pressures of war. You developed fission not to power cities, but to level them. You reached for space on the back of ballistic missile programs. Your global communication network, the internet you are so proud of, has become a battleground for information, for ideology, for control. You broadcast your triumphs and your tragedies to the stars, and the signal-to-noise ratio of your violence was deafening. It turned its gaze to Marcus, and for the first time he saw not fear or reverence, but a genuine, bewildered sorrow. Your violent history frightened us, Progenitor. It is the reason the Conclave debated for decades, centuries even, about making formal contact. We saw a species of immense creativity and resilience, yes, but one seemingly addicted to its own self-destruction. We saw the children of gods playing with primitive sharpened stones, unaware of the divine legacy sleeping in their genes. We feared that contact, that awakening, might not lead to a new golden age, but to a galaxy-wide conflagration. What if your innate talent for conflict, once combined with progenitor-level technology, made you the ultimate predator? Our caution was not born from arrogance, but from a deep and abiding terror. The officer's shoulders slumped, but our desperation overrode that caution. The devourer plague does not negotiate, it does not fear, it simply consumes. Faced with the certain, silent end of our entire species, the calculated risk of abducting a single, seemingly primitive Terran soldier felt like our only option. We believed the potential reward, a cure, outweighed the immense risk of provoking a species we perceived as universally and unpredictably violent. In that moment, standing amidst the evidence of humanity's darkest hours curated by an outside perspective, Marcus felt a cold clarity settle over him. He saw the terrifying truth of the galaxy's first impression of humankind. They hadn't received our art, our philosophy, our music of the spheres. They had received our wartime news reports, our propaganda films, our cyber attack logs, and our social media vitriol. They had seen the worst of us amplified across the light years and had understandably recoiled. Their sin was not malice, but a tragic misreading born from a limited, terrifying dataset. They saw the shadow humanity cast and mistook it for our entire substance. And now, the fate of their entire civilization rested on proving that initial assessment wrong. The transition from the silent void to the heart of human governance was anything but subtle. One moment the skies over New York were a clear, crisp blue, and the next they were dominated by the impossible geometry of the Xylosian vessel. It didn't decloak in a dramatic shimmer. It simply was there, a silent, silver mountain hanging low over the East River, casting a vast, cool shadow over the United Nations headquarters. The global response was instantaneous and chaotic. Air defense sirens wailed across the eastern seaboard. Fighter jets were scrambled, their contrails cutting across the sky as they established a wide, nervous perimeter. News helicopters, drawn by the spectacle like moths to a flame, were held back by military order, their cameras zooming in from a distance. Below, the streets of Manhattan erupted into a mixture of panic, awe, and sheer disbelief. This was not a movie. This was the day the world changed forever. Inside the UN, emergency protocols that had been theoretical for decades were activated. Diplomats, aides, and security personnel moved through the halls with a frantic energy, their faces pale. The Security Council was convened in an emergency session, but their discussions were paralyzed by a fundamental lack of information. Who were these visitors? Were they hostile? What was their intention? The world held its breath, waiting for the first move in a game where humanity didn't even know the rules. The move came not from the ship, but from a small access hatch that earized open on its underside. A ramp extended and a figure emerged into the blinding sunlight. It was a human figure clad in the familiar, if slightly battered, flight suit of an Earth military pilot. It was Marcus Thorne walking with a steady, confident pace that seemed utterly at odds with the surreal circumstances. The collective gasp from those watching live feeds around the planet was almost audible. He was alive, he was unharmed, and he was not alone. Following him, moving with a cautious, deliberate grace, were 3 of the slender, silver-skinned Xylosians. They made no aggressive moves, their long hands held open and visible. They kept close to Marcus, their large dark eyes taking in the scene not with conquest, but with a palpable, nervous apprehension. This was their moment of truth, their first step onto the world of their creators, and they were completely at the mercy of a species they had profoundly misjudged. A phalanx of stunned UN security forces met them at the bottom of the ramp, their weapons raised but their commands hesitant, unsure of who was in charge. Marcus didn't break stride. He looked the lead security officer in the eye, his voice calm and authoritative, cutting through the sirens and the shouting. "Stand down. I am Major Marcus Thorne, and these are my guests. We require immediate and secure access to the Secretary General and the Security Council. The fate of an entire species depends on what we have to say." The sheer audacity of the statement, delivered with such unshakable conviction, created a bubble of stunned silence around him. The security detail, trained for every conceivable threat, had no protocol for a returning POW escorting his alien captors as diplomatic guests. Within minutes, the world watched on live television as Marcus Thorne, a man who had been declared missing in action just days before, walked back into the building from which he had been taken, now with an extraterrestrial delegation in tow. He was ushered into the packed Security Council chamber, where every representative sat in breathless silence. Cameras focused on him as he approached the central podium. He looked out at the faces of the world's most powerful leaders, their expressions a mixture of fear, confusion, and desperate hope. He didn't waste a second. "Mr. Secretary General, distinguished members of the Council," he began, his voice clear and firm, echoing in the hushed room. "The beings with me are the Xylosians. They did take me from my aircraft. Their methods were invasive, and their first impression of us was flawed, born from centuries of observing only the worst of our broadcasts." He paused, letting the admission of abduction sink in before immediately reframing it. "But they are not conquerors, they are refugees. Their entire civilization is facing a biological apocalypse, a plague that is turning their people into living crystal. They came to us because their creators, our ancestors, left a cure locked away in a genetic vault, a vault that only a human can open." He let the monumental weight of that statement hang in the air for a moment, watching the dawning comprehension on the faces before him. Then he delivered the line that would be replayed on news networks for generations. "They need our help," he announced, his gaze sweeping across the chamber, "and we hold all the cards. Every single one. The decision to grant them access to this cure, the decision to save billions of lives, rests solely with us, with humanity." The chamber, which had been holding its breath, erupted. Diplomats leaped to their feet, shouting questions in a dozen different languages. The video feeds to capitals around the world suddenly buzzed with frantic activity as leaders consulted with advisors, their carefully constructed worldviews shattering in real time. The scramble had begun. It was no longer a question of how to fight an alien invasion, but how to manage an unprecedented interstellar humanitarian crisis where humanity, for the first time, was not the supplicant, but the sole arbiter of life and death. The children of Earth had just been handed the keys to the kingdom, and the entire galaxy was waiting to see what they would do with them. The confirmation of Marcus's genetic identity sent shockwaves through the scientific and political communities of Earth, but it was only the beginning of the mystery. A joint human-Xylosian science team was immediately assembled, drawing the finest geneticists, historians, and engineers from both species. Their first directive was simple: run a full genomic sequence on Marcus Thorne. The results, compiled in a secure lab deep beneath the Swiss Alps, were not just surprising, they were paradigm-shattering. interwoven throughout his DNA like ghostly lines of code in a vast and ancient program, were unique non-coding sequences the Xylosians termed progenitor markers. These weren't active genes, they were dormant signifiers, a biological signature of ownership that their technology was hardwired to recognize and obey. To the Xylosian scientists, this was a moment of religious awe. They watched the data stream with a reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. For the human scientists, it was a dizzying puzzle. How could these markers exist? Were they in everyone, or was Marcus a unique fluke? Further testing provided the staggering answer. The markers were present in every human DNA sample tested from every corner of the globe. Their concentration and configuration varied slightly, but the core signature was universal. Humanity wasn't just descended from the progenitors. Every single person carried the faded, biological key to their ancestors' empire within every cell of their body. We weren't living in the ruins of a fallen empire. We were the scattered, amnesiac heirs to the throne, walking around with the kingdom's master key in our pockets and never knowing it. This revelation sparked a global hunt, a digital and archaeological treasure hunt on an unprecedented scale. If every human was a key, where were the locks? The Xylosians provided their millennia of deep space scans and planetary surveys, while Earth's most powerful supercomputers, from IBM's Summit to China's Sunway, began cross-referencing this celestial data with every known anomaly in our own solar system. They were searching for energy signatures that matched progenitor technology, for gravitational quirks, for anything that shouldn't be there. For days, the search yielded nothing but cosmic noise. Then, a junior astrophysicist at the European Space Agency, Dr. Marcus Thorne, no relation to Marcus, noticed something everyone else had missed. For decades, lunar orbital satellites had recorded a faint, persistent, and entirely unexplained energy reading emanating from the Mare Ingenii, the Sea of Cleverness, on the far side of the Moon. It was so weak and constant that it had been dismissed as instrument error or background radiation and filed away. But when filtered through the new progenitor energy profile provided by the Xylosians, that faint signal screamed. It was a perfect match, a beacon humming softly in the darkness for millennia, waiting for someone with the right ears to finally hear its call. A mission was launched within hours. Marcus, a team of human and Xylosian scientists, and a security detail boarded a Xylosian shuttle and broke orbit, heading for the Moon. As their craft descended toward the barren, gray landscape of the Mare Ingenii, the energy readings on their sensors spiked from a whisper to a roar. The very rock beneath them began to resonate. Then, with a silence that was more profound than any sound, a vast section of the lunar surface, hundreds of square miles of dust and cratered rock, began to retract. Immense, perfectly fitted hexagonal plates slid aside with impossible grace, revealing not a cave or a simple installation, but a breathtaking, continent-sized chasm that plunged deep into the Moon's crust. This was no mere outpost, it was a metropolis hidden in plain sight, a lunar arcology built by gods. The shuttle descended into the abyss, its lights reflecting off smooth, obsidian walls that seemed to drink the light. They touched down in a central plaza so vast its ceiling was lost in darkness, its scale dwarfing every human structure ever built. As Marcus stepped onto the floor, his boots kicking up tiny clouds of moon dust that had settled over eons, the entire city began to wake. Light followed his footsteps, flowing out from panels in the floor and walls in soft, liquid waves, illuminating avenues and towers that had known only blackness for countless generations. Silent, elegant machines that resembled living mercury awoke from their slumber and glided through the air not as threats but as eager servants awaiting commands from their returned master. At the center of the plaza stood a monolithic structure, a spire of pure crystal that pulsed with a soft, internal light. As Marcus approached, an interface formed in the air before him, a holographic console of shimmering light and complex, intuitive symbols. He didn't need to read a manual, his very DNA knew what to do. He placed his hand on the console. The crystal spire flared with incandescent light, and information began to flood into his mind and across every screen on the shuttle. It wasn't data delivered in files or packets. It was a living history, a song of creation poured directly into their consciousness. They saw it all, the meticulous stellar cartography that mapped not just stars but their life-bearing potential. The breathtakingly elegant genetic libraries containing the blueprints for every species they had ever engineered, from the silver-skinned Xylosians to the silicon-based life forms of the Kepler systems. Architectural schematics for ringworlds and Dyson spheres, philosophical treatises on the ethics of creation and the burden of godhood, medical texts describing technologies that could regenerate limbs, cure any disease, and reverse aging itself. This was the lost library of Alexandria, but for an entire galactic civilization. It was the complete and utter sum of human knowledge from an age when we were not just a species on a planet, but the gardeners of the galaxy. The silence in that vast chamber was broken only by the soft, awestruck weeping of a Xylosian scientist as he witnessed the full glory of his creators. For the humans, the emotion was more complex, a dizzying mixture of immense pride and a crushing, humbling sense of loss. We had once been this, we had built this. And we had forgotten it all, reduced to squabbling over patches of dirt on a single, tiny world while the keys to the universe lay buried in our own backyard, waiting for us to simply look up and remember who we were. The discovery on the moon wasn't just about finding a cure for the Xylosians. It was about humanity rediscovering its own soul and the unimaginable destiny that had been patiently waiting for us to come home. The Lunar Archive's revelation was a tide of wonder, but a single, chilling piece of data demanded immediate attention: the genetic profile of the devourer plague. A dedicated, high-security laboratory was established within the moon base itself, a sterile chamber where the finest biological minds from Earth and Xylos could work side by side. The atmosphere was a tense fusion of awe and dread. Human scientists in biosafety suits operated alongside their slender, silver-skinned counterparts, all of them aware that the samples being handled under the powerful containment fields represented the extinction of an entire civilization. They began with the afflicted, a cryogenically preserved Xylosian patient, a volunteer from their doomed homeworld, transported to the lunar facility. The initial scans were horrific. The transformation was not a simple disease. It was a systemic, hyper-accelerated rewrite of biology. The victim's vibrant silver skin was now a dull, opaque gray, its texture closer to rough-hewn granite than flesh. Internal scans showed a nightmarish landscape. Organs had lost their pliancy, transformed into brittle, crystalline structures that could no longer perform their functions. The brain, the seat of consciousness, was encased in a lattice of mineral, its neural pathways frozen in a final, silent scream. It was a living death, a statue of a being, its mind trapped behind unfeeling eyes. Dr. Lena Chen, a leading xenogeneticist from Geneva, led the human contingent. For 72 hours, she and her team, along with the lead Xylosian biosavant, pored over the data. They mapped the plague's progression at a molecular level, tracing its insidious pathway through the Xylosian body. They expected a naturally evolved pathogen, a cosmic accident of terrifying proportions. What they found was something far more sinister. The plague's structure was elegant, ruthlessly efficient, and unmistakably artificial. Its method of attack wasn't a chaotic replication. It was a precise key and lock mechanism designed to seek out and bind with specific, unique sequences found only in Xylosian DNA. Dr. Chen finally stood before the assembled team, her face pale but her voice steady, the gravity of her conclusion silencing the hum of the lab. "It's artificial," she announced, the words hanging in the sterile air. "This is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. Every aspect of its design, the delivery system, the targeting mechanism, the rate of cellular crystallization shows a level of engineering sophistication we can barely comprehend." It was designed with one purpose, to target Xylosian DNA specifically. A grim silence followed her statement. Then, the Xylosian lead scientist, its voice a trembling whisper, voiced the terrifying implication that was dawning on everyone in the room. The genetic markers it targets, they are the core sequences gifted to us by the progenitors. They are the very foundation of our species. The horrifying truth settled over the lab like a shroud. The weapon was not designed by some unknown alien enemy. Its architecture, its fundamental biosignature, bore the unmistakable hallmarks of progenitor technology. It was a ghost from their own creator's past. This revelation sent a seismic shock through the Alliance, fundamentally altering the moral landscape of their mission. The ethical questions it raised were profound and deeply unsettling. Was this a failed progenitor weapon, a creation that had somehow escaped its containment and turned on its intended beneficiaries? Or was it something far darker? Could it have been a deliberate safeguard, a built-in fail-safe designed to eliminate a creation that had somehow deviated from its programming? The ancient humans they were beginning to revere as near-mythical terraformers now had a shadow side. They were not just life-giving gardeners, they were also capable of designing the most precise, horrifyingly final genocide tool imaginable. The heirs to this legacy, modern humanity, now had to confront the terrifying power and the immense moral responsibility they had unknowingly inherited. They weren't just handing over a cure, they were potentially undoing a judgment passed by their own ancestors. The discovery that the Devourer plague was not a random cosmic tragedy, but a meticulously engineered weapon potentially of human origin, detonated a moral bomb at the heart of the fledgling human-Xylosian alliance. The data from the Lunar Archive was irrefutable. The plague's architecture was a perfect, albeit horrific, mirror of progenitor design principles. It was elegant, efficient, and terrifyingly specific. This revelation transformed the global conversation overnight, shifting it from a straightforward debate about interstellar aid into a profound and painful inquiry into inherited guilt, cosmic justice, and the very soul of humanity. News networks and social media platforms fractured into 1,000 opposing camps. The initial wave of universal sympathy for the Xylosians crashed against the rocks of this new, horrifying possibility. One faction, led by prominent historians and ethicists, argued vehemently for non-intervention. Their position was stark and chillingly logical. If our ancestors, for reasons we may never fully understand, deemed this species too dangerous or too deviant to exist and built a tool for its eradication, who were we to overturn that ancient judgment? They painted the progenitors as wise, far-seeing gods whose reasons were beyond our petty mortal comprehension. Interfering, they argued, would be the height of arrogance, akin to a child disarming a security system their genius parent installed to protect the house. "Let sleeping gods lie" became their mantra. We risk unleashing a horror our forebears contained for a reason. The opposing view, championed by Marcus Thorne and a coalition of scientists and human rights leaders, framed the issue not through the lens of the past but through the imperative of the present. They argued that modern humanity could not be held accountable for the actions of beings who might as well be mythological figures. "We are not our ancestors," Marcus stated in a globally televised address from the UN podium, standing beside the silent, anxious Xylosian ambassador. "We did not design this weapon, we did not deploy it. We have spent our entire history struggling toward enlightenment, fighting our own worst instincts. To now be asked to bear the sin of a decision made by gods 100,000 years ago is an absurdity. Our responsibility is not to blindly execute a sentence from a forgotten court, but to act with the mercy and reason we hope defines us today." This philosophical schism paralyzed the United Nations. Emergency sessions stretched for days, filled with heated, emotional rhetoric. Delegates from nations with deep cultural traditions of ancestral honor argued that the progenitors' will must be respected, that to undo their work was a profound act of disrespect. Others, from countries forged by breaking away from old-world traditions, argued that progress demanded they break this most ancient of chains. The tension reached its peak during a closed-door session of the Security Council. The air was thick with exhaustion and unresolved fear. The representative from a major world power, his face etched with the weight of the decision, slammed his hand on the table. "We are being asked to save a people our own flesh and blood may have tried to destroy. How can we possibly make this choice without knowing why? What if they deserved it?" It was then that the UN Secretary General, a woman known for her quiet diplomacy, rose to her feet. The room fell silent. Her voice, usually soft, was firm and carried a gravitas that stilled the arguing. "We are digging for reasons in the dust of eons," she began, her eyes scanning the faces of the world's most powerful leaders. "We will likely never know the progenitors' true motive. Was it a punishment, a safety protocol, a terrible mistake? The answer died with them. But their reasons are not what matters here today. Our reasons are." She paused, letting the words sink in. "We are not responsible for the actions of our ancestors. That is a burden too ancient and too heavy for any living soul to bear. But we are utterly, completely accountable for our response to this crisis now. We hold the power of life and death over billions of thinking, feeling beings. The question before us is not what would the progenitors have done. The only question that matters is what does it mean to be human now? Do we choose to perpetuate a cycle of ancient violence, a judgment from a court that no longer exists? Or do we choose to break that cycle? Do we choose to define our own legacy, one of compassion over blind obedience, of hope over inherited fear? Her speech did not magically resolve the debate, but it fundamentally reframed it. The conversation shifted from abstract arguments about the past to a concrete choice about the future identity of the human species. Marcus, seizing on this momentum, made his final, personal appeal. He spoke not as a soldier or a progenitor's heir, but as a man who had looked into the eyes of the desperate. "They made a terrible mistake with me," he admitted. "They acted out of fear and saw us as monsters. We have a choice they never gave us. We can show them they were wrong. We can prove that the best of humanity isn't our capacity for war, but our capacity for grace. Let's not give them the monster they feared. Let's give them the saviors they never dared hope for." The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous. But it was decisive. Humanity, flawed, divided, and fearful, looked into the abyss of its own potential for cruelty and chose instead to step back into the light. The directive was sent to the lunar facility: proceed with the synthesis and delivery of the universal remedy. The decision was made. Mercy had won. But as the machinery of salvation whirred to life, a new, more unsettling thought began to form in the minds of every leader on Earth. If we could undo a genocide designed by our ancestors, what other power and what other responsibilities had we just unlocked? The journey to Mars was a silent, solemn pilgrimage. The sleek Xylosian vessel, now with a contingent of human officials and scientists aboard, sliced through the void toward the red planet. All debates, all fears, all lofty philosophical arguments were now behind them. The decision had been made. Humanity had chosen mercy. But as the rusty orb of Mars filled the main viewport, a new, more tangible dread took hold. The cure existed, but accessing it was the final, most terrifying step. The lunar archives had provided the coordinates and a single, ominous warning. The vault was not a simple repository. It was a final arbiter, a system of last resort designed for a purpose they could only guess at. Only a living Terran Prime signature could awaken it, and Marcus Thorne was the key. The landing site was in the Valles Marineris, the grandest canyon in the solar system, a scar on the face of Mars that could swallow Earth's entire Grand Canyon with room to spare. Their ship settled on a windswept plateau that looked no different from any other patch of the barren, red landscape. But as Marcus stepped onto the rust-colored regolith, the ground responded. A deep, subsonic hum vibrated through their boots, and a colossal, perfectly hexagonal section of the canyon wall, miles wide, began to retract in absolute silence. It revealed not a cave, but a yawning entrance into a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow the very light from the Martian sun. This was not a hidden base. It was a gateway. Marcus led the way, a single human figure walking into the immensity of the opening, followed by a hushed procession of humans and Xylosians. The air inside was still and cold, smelling of ancient dust and ozone. As he progressed, light bloomed from the floor and walls, not in a sudden burst, but flowing outward from his position like a wave, illuminating a passageway that descended at a sharp angle deep into the Martian crust. The architecture was unmistakably Progenitor, sweeping, organic curves fused with impossibly sharp geometric precision, all carved from a single, seamless dark material. After what felt like an hour of descent, the passage opened into a cavern so vast its ceiling was lost in gloom. At its center stood a single structure, a monolithic spire of obsidian that mirrored the one on the moon, but this one pulsed with a slow, deep, crimson light like a dormant heart. This was no library of knowledge, this was an engine of life and death. As Marcus approached the central dais, a complex holographic interface materialized in the air before him. It was more intricate and more severe than the one on the moon, filled with symbols that conveyed not information but consequence. Back on the ship and at mission control on Earth, every screen was locked on Marcus's helmet cam feed and his bio readouts. The world watched, holding its breath. They saw his hand, encased in his suit's glove, reach out and press against the console. The crimson light in the spire flared, then shifted to a brilliant, pure white. A series of data streams, too fast for the human eye to follow, cascaded across the display. Marcus stood motionless for a long moment, his body rigid. Then his voice crackled over the comms, calm but laced with a tremor of sheer, unvarnished awe. The system is online, it's reading me, it knows why I'm here. There was another pause, the only sound the static hiss of the transmission. When he spoke again, his words were measured, each one dropping into the listening silence like a stone into a still pond. It's presenting me with two options, a longer pause filled with a dawning horror that those listening could feel through his voice alone. The system is asking me to choose. It wants to know if I wish to activate the healing grace or the final silence. A wave of confusion swept through the observers. The terms meant nothing. But Marcus, connected directly to the archive's intent, understood everything. His next transmission was not just a report, it was a revelation that unraveled the last of the mystery and replaced it with a chilling, absolute truth. His voice was hollow with the weight of it. The cure and the plague, they aren't separate things. They are two sides of the same technology. The universal remedy and the devourer weapon are part of a single system. This vault doesn't just hold the cure, it is the cure and it is the weapon. The progenitors didn't just make a failsafe, they built a single control for both creation and annihilation. The silence on the comms was absolute. The stunning implication was clear. The godlike beings who had seeded the galaxy with life had also installed a permanent genetic kill switch for every species they ever made, and a human finger was now hovering over the button. The choice presented by the Martian spire was not an abstract moral test. It was the ultimate expression of an ancient and terrible responsibility. This was the truth the Xylosians had feared to uncover. Their historians, the keepers of their species' oldest and most sacred lore, watched Marcus's silent struggle with the console and knew the moment had come to reveal the full, unvarnished context of their creator's disappearance. The lead Xylosian commander, its voice a hushed, reverent tone over the comms, began to speak, translating myths into a history that reshaped humanity's understanding of its own past. You ask why the progenitors would build such a thing. The commander said, its large eyes fixed on Marcus's rigid form. Our oldest legends, the ones we teach our young as fables, speak of it. In our tongue, they were not just progenitors, they were the makers, the architects of life itself, but their story does not end in glory. It ends in a great silence born from an even greater ethical crisis. The aliens' gaze grew distant as if looking across the millennia. The tales say the Maker's power grew too absolute. They could craft a star system or unmake a species with the same effortless thought. And in their perfection, they faced a question that has haunted all creators. When does the act of creation become an act of tyranny? When does the gardener's shears used to shape the garden become the executioner's axe? The commander's words painted a picture of a civilization at the peak of its power, yet paralyzed by the weight of its own godhood. They had seeded the galaxy with thousands of species, each a beautiful, unique experiment. But some of their creations grew in ways they had not foreseen. Some became violent, expansionist empires. Others developed psionic abilities that threatened the fabric of local spacetime. The Makers were faced with an impossible choice: intervene and become eternal, meddling police, or stand aside and allow their creations to destroy themselves and others. The legend says they argued for 1,000 years. The Xylosian continued. Some advocated for a guiding hand, a gentle stewardship. Others believed any intervention beyond the initial act of creation was a violation of free will. But a third, more fearful faction, they argued for a final solution. They built the system you now command. They believed that if a creation turned malignant, the only moral choice was a swift, merciful end. This was the genesis of the dual-purpose vault on Mars, not a weapon of conquest, but a tool of heartbreaking last resort, a safeguard born from a profound philosophical despair. The commander's voice dropped to a whisper filled with ancient sorrow. But the legends say the Makers could not bear the burden they had created. To hold the power of life and death over all things was a loneliness too great for any soul to endure. They saw the path ahead, an eternity of playing God, of making these unbearable choices, and they recoiled from it. They chose instead a different path. The alien looked at Marcus, and in its gaze was a mixture of pity and awe. The legends say the Makers punished themselves for their ambition. They shattered their own empire, scattering their knowledge to the winds and the moon. They buried their greatest tools, and then they did the one thing their power had made impossible. They forgot. They stripped themselves of their own history, their own glory, and scattered their seed, their own genetic legacy, onto one quiet, isolated world to live as simple creatures, to learn empathy from powerlessness and to start again. The silence on the comms was absolute. Every human listening was reeling from the scale of the story. We weren't the victims of a catastrophe or a fall from grace. Our amnesia was self-inflicted. Our ancestors had looked into the abyss of absolute power and chosen instead to become us. They had chosen a hard, primitive, mortal life over an eternity of playing God. The Xylosian commander watched Marcus, who stood as the living embodiment of that choice, his hand resting on the console that represented everything his ancestors had run from. "You are not just their heir," the alien said softly, its words meant for Marcus but heard by all of humanity. "You are their penance, and you are their second chance." The weight on Marcus's shoulders was no longer just metaphorical. It felt like the entire mass of Mars was pressing down on him, concentrated in that single point where his gloved hand made contact with the console. The holographic interface displayed the two options with a terrifying, stark simplicity. On one side, a symbol that resonated in his mind as healing grace, a complex, beautiful glyph that pulsed with a soft blue light promising salvation. On the other, the final silence, represented by a stark, angular rune that glowed with a cold, final red. The system awaited his choice, the fate of a species hanging on his next breath. Back on Earth, in the hushed United Nations chamber and in billions of homes, the live feed from his helmet camera showed the impossible decision. There was no debate now, no more arguments to be made. The time for philosophy was over. All that remained was action and the terrifying, absolute consequences that would follow. Marcus's voice, when it finally crackled over the comms, was not the steady command of a soldier or the awe-struck whisper of a progenitor's heir. It was the raw, honest voice of a man burdened with a responsibility no single person should ever have to bear. "If I activate the cure," he began, his words measured and heavy, "we don't just save them. We inherit an eternal responsibility for their future. We become their guardians, their stewards. Every choice they make from this day forward, every conflict, every triumph, every failure, it becomes our business. We will be the gods looking over their shoulder forever. The power to grant life comes with the duty to manage it, and that is a path our own ancestors found too lonely and too terrible to walk." The screen showing the healing grace option seemed to shimmer, its promise now laced with the ghost of an infinite, open-ended obligation. He paused, taking a shuddering breath that echoed in the silence of the cavern and in living rooms across the globe. "And if I choose the other option, if I enact the final silence and permanently erase this threat?" His voice grew even quieter, thick with a palpable horror. "Then we become the very monsters we feared we were in their eyes. We would be executing a death sentence on an entire civilization, not for anything they have done, but for what they might become. We would be justifying their initial, worst assumptions about us. We would be choosing certainty over mercy, fear over hope. We would prove that their terror of human violence was not a miscalculation, but a prophecy." The silence that followed was profound. He had articulated the two terrifying futures that branched out from this single moment. One path led to a burden of godhood that had broken a civilization infinitely more advanced than their own. The other path led to a moral damnation from which humanity could never return. There was no third option, no middle ground. This was the price of unlocking the past. It was a poisoned chalice, offering either eternal servitude to power or the absolute corruption of the soul. In that suspended moment, as every human waited, Marcus's mind didn't race. It became preternaturally calm. He thought not of grand philosophies, but of small human moments. He remembered the look in the lead Xylosian's eyes when it offered him its ceremonial blade, a gesture of utter surrender. He remembered the terror in the science officer's voice as it explained their desperation. These were not abstract concepts, they were people. They were a people who had made a catastrophic error in their fear, an error humanity itself had made countless times throughout its own bloody history. To condemn them for that fear would be the height of hypocrisy. His hand did not tremble. With a final, decisive motion, he reached out and pressed the symbol for the healing grace. The console flared with a light so brilliant and pure it was blinding. Throughout the cavern, a resonant tone began to build, like 1,000 bells chiming in perfect harmony. On the main spire, the cold crimson light vanished, replaced by a wave of vibrant, life-affirming blue that raced from its base to its unseen peak high in the darkness. His transmission to Earth was simple. The cure is synthesizing. Tell their conclave to prepare for delivery. There were no cheers on the open channel, only a collective, shuddering exhale from an entire planet. The decision was made. Humanity had chosen to bear the unknown weight of the future rather than the certain stain of an unforgivable present. They had looked into the heart of their own potential for darkness and had consciously, deliberately chosen to step away from it. They had chosen to be better than their fears. The choice was made. There was no grand celestial fanfare, no clap of thunder from the Martian deep. The only sound was the low, resonant hum of the ancient spire as it accepted the command. Within the obsidian monolith, processes older than human civilization stirred to life. A cascade of complex biological data, a symphony of healing code written in the language of life itself, was compiled, verified, and transmitted. It did not travel through wires or radio waves, but through a subspace channel that the progenitors had woven into the fabric of local spacetime, a channel keyed to the genetic resonance of their creations. In an instant, the cure was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost in the machine of reality, reaching out to touch every single Xylosian life sign in the galaxy simultaneously. Aboard the command ship orbiting Earth, the lead Xylosian commander stood rigid, its large black eyes fixed on the main display, which showed the real-time bio-readouts of its plague-ravaged homeworld. The screens were a grim mosaic of despair. Millions of tiny indicators, each representing a citizen, were frozen in the dull, lifeless gray that signified the final stages of crystalline stasis. The commander's slender hands were clenched into tight fists, a gesture of species-wide anguish, and then it happened. A single indicator, representing an elderly teacher in a stasis ward on the capital world, flickered. The dull gray was replaced by a faint, pulsing silver. Then another flickered, a young student in a remote colony, and then another and another, until the entire display began to blink like a field of stars waking up at dusk. The gray receded like a tide pulling back from a shore, replaced by the vibrant, healthy silver of living Xylosian biology. The transformation was not violent, it was a gentle unraveling, a whispered command that told the corrupted cells to remember what they were always meant to be. The brittle, crystalline structures softened, regaining their organic pliancy. Trapped neural pathways crackled back to life, and minds that had been imprisoned in silent, unfeeling stone for months were suddenly, gently, pulled back into the warmth of consciousness. A sound broke the tense silence on the bridge, a choked, shuddering gasp that was half sob, half song. The Xylosian commander, the proud leader of a dying people, sank to its knees, its body trembling with a relief so profound it was physically overwhelming. Iridescent tears, not of pain but of pure, unadulterated joy, streamed from the corners of its large eyes, tracing silver paths down its face. It looked up at Marcus, who was watching the same miracle unfold on a monitor linked from Mars, and its voice, when it finally spoke, was a raw, broken thing, filled with more emotion than its melodic language was ever designed to convey. The readings, they are real, it wept, its words translated for all of humanity to hear. The plague recedes, the transformation is reversing across every infected world. Our people, they are waking up. It pressed its forehead to the cool deck plating in a gesture of utter, awe-struck gratitude. We came to you in arrogance, believing we could take what we needed from a species we considered beneath us. We attempted to violate your mind, to treat you as a resource, and in return, you have given us back our future, your compassion. It shames our aggression, Progenitor. It shames us to our very core. Across the galaxy, on 100 different worlds, the same scene of miraculous rebirth was playing out. In hospitals, medical teams stood in stunned silence as patients they had long since given up for lost began to stir in their beds, their petrified skin softening back to its natural silver sheen. In homes, families watched in tearful disbelief as loved ones they had been mourning slowly opened their eyes, confused and disoriented but very much alive. The data streaming into the Xylosian Central Archives was unequivocal, a tidal wave of positive medical confirmations that overwhelmed their networks. The Devourer plague, the unstoppable scourge that had defined their existence for a generation, was not just being treated, it was being systematically and permanently erased from every infected cell, leaving behind no trace, no scar, only the perfect, healthy biology the progenitors had first designed. On Earth, the reaction was a complex, powerful wave of emotion. There were cheers, of course, jubilant celebrations for a cosmic victory, but for many, the dominant feeling was a deep, humbling silence. They had watched the Xylosian commander, a being of immense technological sophistication, break down in tears of gratitude. They had heard the raw shame in its voice. Humanity had been tested not on a battlefield but at the crossroads of ultimate power and ultimate mercy. And in that moment, seeing the direct, tangible result of their collective choice, a new understanding began to settle over the planet. This was not just about saving another species, it was about defining their own. They had proven to the Xylosians and to themselves that the children of Earth were capable of a grace that far outstripped their technology. They had chosen hope over fear, and in doing so, they had not just healed the Xylosians, they had begun to heal their own view of what it meant to be human. The miraculous reversal of the Devourer plague did not mark an ending, but a profoundly complex beginning. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of diplomatic activity unlike anything Earth had ever witnessed. A formal Xylosian embassy was established within the United Nations complex, its architecture a stunning blend of flowing silver alloys and warm Terran stone, a physical symbol of the new partnership being forged. The initial, fearful interactions gave way to a period of intense, careful negotiation, as both species worked to build a foundation for a relationship that had begun with an abduction and culminated in a salvation. The Xylosian conclave, their ruling body now restored to full capacity, made their opening position one of breathtaking humility and gratitude. Their lead ambassador, no longer the fearful commander but a seasoned diplomat, stood before the full General Assembly and made an offer that left the human delegates speechless. The people of Xylos, she announced, her melodic voice translated into every Earth language, owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid. You were presented with the power of our creators and chose its most compassionate application. In recognition of this, and as a first step toward true partnership, we offer you the complete and unfettered archives of our civilization. The scale of the offering was staggering. It wasn't just their own advanced technology they were sharing, warp drives, energy systems, medical science centuries beyond our own, but something far more precious, their complete historical record spanning over 50,000 years. This was not a simple data transfer, it was an act of supreme vulnerability. They were handing humanity the keys to understanding every Xylosian strength, every weakness, every triumph, and every shameful chapter of their own long history. It was the ultimate gesture of trust, a way to permanently balance the scales of knowledge that had been so lopsided during their initial observation of Earth. Furthermore, they pledged themselves as guides to the Progenitor legacy, offering to help humanity navigate the overwhelming technological and ethical inheritance now sitting dormant on the Moon and Mars. We will help you learn to read the library you have inherited, the ambassador stated, so that you may avoid the philosophical despair that led your ancestors to abandon their own glory. For humanity, this presented an unprecedented opportunity and a minefield of potential problems. The sudden injection of hyper-advanced technology into a global economy still largely powered by fossil fuels threatened to destabilize everything. World leaders, economists, and ethicists engaged in fierce public debates about the pace of integration. Should this knowledge be released all at once, potentially causing societal upheaval, or meted out carefully through a centralized global authority? The conversation echoed the very dilemmas that had plagued the progenitors, bringing an ancient cosmic problem down to a very human, very terrestrial level. The resolution was a masterwork of cautious optimism. A new multinational agency was formed, the Terran Xylosian Exchange Directorate, or TZ. Its mandate was to serve as the sole conduit for the transferred knowledge, overseeing a gradual, ethical, and equitable rollout of new technologies. Priority was given to solving pressing global issues, medical applications that could cure cancer and reverse aging, clean energy systems that could halt climate change in its tracks, and agricultural tech that could end global hunger. The directive ensured that these world-altering advancements would benefit all of humanity, not just the most powerful nations, preventing a new technological arms race on Earth. This period of integration became known as the Great Unveiling, a slow, careful process of rediscovering our own birthright with the help of the species we had saved. Human and Xylosian scientists worked side by side in lunar labs, deciphering progenitor schematics for stargates and planetary restoration engines. Historians pored over Xylosian records, gaining not just a window into an alien culture, but a mirror held up to our own, seeing how our violent broadcasts had been interpreted across the light years. It was a time of immense humility and tremendous growth, a second renaissance sparked by interstellar contact. The new galactic era did not begin with a flash of conquest, but with the quiet, diligent work of builders and healers. The first joint mission was not a warship, but a hospital vessel crewed by both species, traveling to the worlds most ravaged by the plague to offer aid and officially welcome the Xylosian people back into a galaxy they had nearly left forever. The relationship was no longer that of captor and captive, nor even of savior and saved. It had evolved into something entirely new, a partnership between two sibling species, both children of the same ancient architects, one who had kept the memory and one who had forgotten, now reunited and stepping forward into a shared future, forever changed by an act of mercy that reshaped the stars. The collaborative work within the Lunar Archive was a process of constant, breathtaking discovery, but one particular data cluster, buried deep within the biological warfare protocols, refused to yield to simple decryption. It was tagged with the Progenitor equivalent of a highest-level security clearance, its contents shielded behind layers of algorithmic obfuscation that even the Xylosians' most powerful systems couldn't penetrate. For days, a joint team of the finest cryptographers and historians from both species worked in a focused silence, their efforts like trying to pick a lock with tools made of smoke. The breakthrough came not from processing power, but from a simple, almost offhand suggestion from Dr. Lena Chen. "Maybe it's not a code to be broken," she mused, staring at the stubborn, shimmering glyph on the main display. "Maybe it's a lock, and we already have the key." The key, of course, was Marcus. At her urging, he approached the terminal and placed his hand on the interface. The system instantly recognized his genetic sovereignty, and the obfuscation dissolved like morning mist. The data that flooded the screens was not a simple technical manual for the Devourer plague, it was a judicial record. A verdict. It contained detailed logs, stellar cartography of ancient Xylosian expansion, and the solemn proceedings of the Progenitor conclave that had debated their fate. As Marcus and the lead scientists absorbed the information, a grim, sober understanding settled over the room. The truth was far more complex and morally ambiguous than anyone had dared to imagine. Marcus asked for the Xylosian commander to be summoned to the Lunar Archive. When the silver-skinned alien arrived, its demeanor was one of cautious curiosity, unaware that it was about to have its entire species' history rewritten. Marcus stood before the main holographic display, which now showed star charts from 100,000 years in the past. His expression was not one of anger or accusation, but of a profound, almost painful gravity. "The plague was not a mistake," Marcus began, his voice echoing softly in the vast chamber. "And it wasn't a random weapon that escaped its containment. It was a sentence." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. The Xylosian commander tilted its head, its large black eyes reflecting the swirling stellar data. "A sentence for what?" it asked, its melodic voice laced with confusion. Marcus gestured to the display, which zoomed in on a series of star systems. "Your species was not always the cautious, fearful people you are today. Millennia ago, shortly after your creation, you experienced a divergence, a cultural shift toward relentless, violent expansion." The hologram began to play out the history. It showed sleek, predatory Xylosian vessels, their designs far more aggressive than the scientific scouts of the present day, descending on fledgling worlds. They weren't exploring, they were conquering. They subjugated primitive species, strip-mined planets for resources with no regard for ecological balance, and established a ruthless empire that spanned dozens of star systems. They had taken the gift of life from their creators and had twisted it into a tool for domination. The progenitors watched. Marcus continued, his tone even and judicial. They debated for centuries. Some advocated for direct intervention, for simply dismantling your war fleets. Others argued for a guiding hand for education. But a faction, a powerful one, saw the core of the problem. Your aggression wasn't a political stance. It was written into your very evolutionary psychology, an unintended flaw in your genetic coding that expressed itself as a drive for absolute supremacy. You were not evil, you were broken, and you were breaking everything else around you. The commander watched the evidence unfold, the images of enslaved beings, the ecologically scarred worlds, the hubris of its own ancestors with a dawning horror. This was not the sacred history of a chosen people. It was the bloody ledger of a galactic predator. What did they do? It whispered, its voice barely audible. This, Marcus said, his gaze unwavering as he finally delivered the devastating revelation. They chose quarantine over genocide. They could have unmade you. They had the power to simply flick a switch and erase your entire species from existence. That would have been the easy, the clean choice, but they didn't. They saw the spark of something more within you, the potential for the scientific, thoughtful people you would eventually become. So they crafted the most precise, most merciful weapon imaginable. The Devourer Plague was not designed to kill you. It was designed to stop you. It was a cage for your biology, a forced stasis field that would halt your expansion and contain your aggression indefinitely, giving you time, eons of time, to outgrow the flaw they had accidentally written into your genes. They didn't give you a death sentence, they gave you a timeout, a chance to reflect and hopefully to heal. The impact on the Xylosian commander was physical. It staggered back a step, its slender form seeming to shrink under the weight of the truth. The shame it had felt before was now multiplied 1,000-fold. Their entire self-image as victims of a cosmic tragedy crumbled away, revealing an uncomfortable, sobering reality. They were the architects of their own downfall. Their near extinction was not a random act of nature, but the direct consequence of their ancestors' violent choices, met with a punishment of unimaginable restraint and mercy from the very beings they had sought to emulate. The silence in the archive was heavier than any moon rock, filled with the sound of a CIVILIZ, a TION, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, its own soul. The signing ceremony for the new alliance was held not in the halls of the United Nations, but within the heart of the Lunar Archive itself, a profound setting that acknowledged the shared legacy and the difficult truths that now bound both species together. Under the soft, ambient light of the Progenitor city, surrounded by the silent, awe-inspiring evidence of both magnificent creation and terrible power, representatives from Earth and the Xylosian conclave put their official seals on the founding charter of the Terran Coalition. The air was thick with a sense of occasion, a palpable feeling that every person present was witnessing the first page of a new chapter, not just for their peoples, but for the entire galactic neighborhood. Marcus Thorne, now formally appointed as the first human ambassador to the coalition, stood before the assembled delegates. He was no longer dressed in a military flight suit, but in a simple, dark uniform that bore no insignia of any single nation, only the new emblem of the coalition, a human hand and a Xylosian hand clasped together within a stylized helix. His face, illuminated by the gentle glow of the archive, was serious, etched with the weight of all he had seen and learned. When he spoke, his voice carried through the vast chamber with a quiet authority that needed no amplification. The progenitors left us two inheritances, he began, his gaze sweeping over the human and Xylosian faces. They left us the tools to build paradise, and they left us the tools to enact absolute judgment. They mastered the universe, but in the end, they could not master the burden of that power. They chose amnesia over omnipotence. We stand here today as the heirs to both their glory and their despair. He paused, letting the history of the place settle around them. The Xylosians looked into the abyss of their own violent past and emerged with a culture of caution and profound scientific curiosity. Humanity looked into the abyss of its potential for mercy and chose compassion over conquest. We have both seen the worst of what we can be, and we have both chosen to strive for something better. He turned to directly address the Xylosian delegation, his expression one of forthright honesty. Our ancestors judged yours. They contained a threat, but in doing so, they also imprisoned a potential. They paused your story, believing that given enough time, you would find your own way to a better path, and you did. Then he turned his focus to his own people. And we must now judge our own ancestors' choice. Was it right to use such a permanent, horrific solution? Was it mercy, or was it a failure of imagination? We will never know for certain, and that is the point. This brought him to the core of his declaration, the central tenet that would be engraved on the cornerstone of the Terran Coalition. We cannot be paralyzed by the past, he stated, his voice growing stronger, more resonant. We must learn from both our ancestors' mistakes. Their greatest error was not in creating the weapon or the cure. It was in believing that any one species could hold such power alone, without counsel, without check, without the perspective of another. That is the loneliness that broke them. He lifted the signed charter, a simple date, a slate that represented the future. This coalition is our answer to their failure. It is our vow that never again will one people sit in solitary judgment over another. Strength must never again be guided by fear or isolation. From this day forward, he proclaimed, his words echoing through the chamber and across the feeds to both worlds, mercy must guide strength, not fear. Curiosity must guide caution, and partnership must guide power. The signing was not met with raucous celebration, but with a moment of shared, solemn reflection. The Terran Coalition was born not from a victory in battle, but from a hard-won victory over the darkest impulses of both species. It was a promise to walk a new path together, to explore the Progenitor legacy not as masters, but as students, and to face whatever wonders or threats the galaxy held with a united front, forever mindful that the true measure of a civilization is not the height of its technology, but the depth of its compassion. They looked toward a shared future, no longer as captor and captive, or even as savior and saved, but as siblings who had finally found each other after a long and painful separation, ready to face the unknown as one. The first joint mission of the Terran Coalition was a vessel unlike any seen before in either species' history, a beautiful, impossible fusion of organic Xylosian curves and angular human pragmatism, christened the Chimera. Its crew was a living testament to the new alliance. Human engineers with their intuitive, sometimes reckless, problem-solving working alongside Xylosian scientists whose methodical precision was now tempered by a newfound humility. Their mission was one of peaceful exploration, a systematic survey of the next set of coordinates unlocked from the lunar archive, a star system the Progenitors had designated only as K77b. The journey through the newly charted warp corridor was a seamless glide, a testament to the successful merging of technologies. The mood aboard was one of focused anticipation, a shared excitement for the wonders they might uncover. The target was a rogue planet, a dark world untethered to any star, drifting in the eternal night of interstellar space. Progenitor sensors had detected a faint energy signature from its surface, a whisper in the void that had persisted for millennia. As the Chimera entered orbit, its powerful scanners revealed nothing but a barren, frozen ball of rock, its surface scarred by eons of cosmic radiation and asteroid impacts. There were no towering cities, no continental engines, no signs of the grand architecture found on the Moon and Mars. Only a single, low structure nestled in a deep impact crater, so small and nondescript it would have been missed by any scan less sensitive than a Progenitor's. The landing party, a mix of humans in powered environmental suits and Xylosians in their own form-fitting silvery encounter suits, moved across the pitch-black landscape under the glaring lights of their shuttle. The air was an absolute vacuum, the cold so profound it seemed to swallow sound itself. The structure they approached was a simple, dark trapezoid, no larger than a small house, its surface utterly featureless. There was no door, no control panel, no visible seam. It was less a building and more a stone slab dropped from the heavens. Following protocol, Ambassador Marcus Thorne, who had joined the mission as a civilian advisor, approached the obsidian wall. As before, the material recognized his touch, but this time the response was different. There was no welcoming hum, no wave of gentle light. Instead, a section of the wall simply vanished, not irising open but ceasing to exist, revealing a dark opening that led not into a room, but onto a descending staircase carved from the same impossible material. The air that whispered out was not the stale breath of a tomb, but oddly fresh, carrying a faint metallic scent that tickled the back of the throat. The team descended, their lights piercing a darkness so absolute it felt solid. The stairs ended not in a grand chamber, but in a single, circular room. Its walls were lined not with data crystals or humming machines, but with terminals of a stark, utilitarian design the team had not seen in any other progenitor site. There were no vistas of creation here, no libraries of knowledge. The atmosphere was one of grim function, of pure, unadorned purpose. At the center of the room stood a single console, and above it a holographic projector. As Marcus activated it, the device didn't display complex schematics or star maps. It projected a single, looping image, a symbol. It was a jagged, asymmetrical rune, all harsh angles and piercing lines that seemed to writhe and twist in on itself. It was utterly alien, fundamentally other, and looking at it invoked a primal, species-deep sense of wrongness, of dissonance. The human crew felt a cold knot of dread form in their stomachs. The Xylosians experienced a psionic feedback that manifested as a sharp, collective migraine. This was not a symbol of creation, it was a sigil of annihilation. The lead mission commander, a seasoned Xylosian astrophysicist named Vora, accessed the console. Data began to stream across her screen, translated by the ship's linguistic AI. Her initial professional curiosity quickly melted away, replaced by a growing, ice-cold horror that was visible in the way her slender shoulders tensed and her long fingers began to tremble. She scanned through logs, damage reports, and casualty lists from a conflict so ancient it predated the seeding of Xylosian life. The records were fragmented, corrupted by time, and what seemed to be intentional data scrubbing, but the story they told was terrifyingly clear. She turned to the rest of the team, her large black eyes wide not with awe, but with a fear so profound it silenced the entire chamber. Her voice, when it came over the comms, was a strained, hushed thing, stripped of all its usual melodic cadence. "We found something unsettling," she began, the understatement hanging in the dead air. "This isn't a terraforming outpost or a library, this is a listening post. A watchtower and the archives. They suggest our ancestors didn't just choose to forget out of philosophical despair." She took a shuddering breath, the sound loud in the helmets of the human crew. They were running, they shattered their empire, buried their technology, and scattered their own seed to the winds, not as an act of penance, but as a strategy. A desperate final strategy to hide. They fled from something even they feared. The data from the rogue planet outpost was not an isolated nightmare. It was the first piece of a terrifying new puzzle. As the shock of the discovery reverberated through the Terran coalition, a massive, unprecedented research initiative was launched. The directive was simple and urgent: cross-reference everything. Human historians, with their deep, nuanced understanding of our own cyclical rises and falls, were paired with Xylosian archivists whose species had meticulously recorded 50 millennia of their own history and that of other civilizations they had observed. They began the painstaking work of combing through the newly recovered progenitor records, searching for echoes, for patterns that might explain the chilling symbol found in the dark. What they uncovered in the following weeks was a narrative that rewrote the history of the galaxy. transforming it from a story of random evolution into a chronicle of deliberate and sometimes desperate curation. The records, once properly decoded and aligned, revealed a staggering truth. The rise and fall of civilizations were not random accidents of cosmic fate. They were part of a vast, repeating cycle, a rhythm of creation, observation, and, when necessary, intervention. The progenitors had not been passive gardeners. They had been active and often agonized stewards of life itself. The Devourer event that had nearly erased the Xylosians was not a unique tragedy. It was merely the most recent entry in a long and somber log. The archive spoke of the silicon-based crystalline intelligences of the Cygnus X1 system, whose harmonious psionic song had, over millennia, slowly mutated into a psychic scream that was unraveling the local fabric of spacetime. The Progenitor logs showed the deployment of a harmonic dampener, a technology that did not destroy the beings but gently placed their entire star system into a permanent, silent time dilation bubble containing the threat forever. They uncovered records of the gas giant, dwelling leviathans of Zeta Reticuli, whose biological imperative to consume all matter in their path had led them to devour 3 of their own moons, threatening the stability of their entire planetary system. The solution was a metabolic rewrite, a subtle genetic tweak delivered via tailored virus that altered their fundamental drive from consumption to a stable, photosynthetic existence. Each case was different, yet underpinned by the same heartbreakingly consistent philosophy. The progenitors did not relish their role as judges. Their logs were filled with anguish, with centuries-long debates over the ethics of each action. They always sought the most minimal, most reversible intervention possible. They preferred guidance and subtle manipulation over outright force. But when a species' path threatened not only itself but the stability of other life, their protocols demanded a response. The tools of last resort, the Devourer plague, the harmonic dampener, the final silence, were never their first choice, but they were a choice they were willing to make to preserve the greater whole. This was not the act of cruel gods, but of responsible parents making impossible decisions for children who had grown dangerous. This revelation cast the progenitors' final act of self-imposed amnesia in a completely new and even more tragic light. Their flight was not just from a single external threat symbolized by the jagged rune. It was also a flight from the immense, soul-crushing burden of being the galaxy's eternal guardians. They had looked out across the cosmos they had seeded and seen an infinite future of these impossible choices, an eternity of playing referee to life itself. The loneliness Vora had sensed was not just physical. It was a moral and existential isolation so profound that forgetting who they were became the only escape. They chose to become us-flawed, mortal, and free rather than remain as perfected, tormented gods. In doing so, they left their tools behind, not for us to wield, but as a warning of the terrible responsibility that comes with absolute power. The emerging pattern was clear. Cosmic stewardship is not a privilege. It is a burden that can break even the most advanced civilization. And it is a burden that has now, inevitably, fallen into the hands of its former victims. The subtle, humming presence of the progenitor technology had become a constant in Marcus's mind, a new layer of reality he could feel but not see. It began as a faint pressure behind his eyes during his first interactions with the lunar archive, a sensation he dismissed as fatigue. But aboard the Xylosian ship, surrounded by their advanced systems that were, in their own way, crude imitations of his ancestors' work, the pressure coalesced into something more. He found he could sense the ship's internal network not as an abstract concept, but as a living, flowing current of data and energy. He could feel the strain in a power conduit before a warning light ever flashed on a console, or sense the subtle shift in the artificial gravity a split second before it adjusted. It wasn't a conscious effort, it was an instinct, like knowing where his own limbs were in the dark. This nascent awareness bloomed into full-blown ability during the tense journey to Mars. Standing before the heart of the ancient Martian vault, with his hand on the console that held the power of life and death, the connection snapped into place with the force of a thunderclap. He wasn't just using the console, he was the console. He felt the flow of the cure being synthesized not as data on a screen, but as a tangible wave of healing energy rippling out through subspace, touching every afflicted Xylosian simultaneously. In that moment, his consciousness didn't feel like it was contained within his skull. It felt like it was woven into the very fabric of the machine, and by extension, the universe it commanded. In the days that followed, the changes accelerated. His thought processes, once linear and strategic, became vast, multi-threaded operations. He could hold a complex conversation with a Xylosian diplomat while simultaneously calculating the gravitational stress on a distant star system and composing a detailed report, all without a moment of cognitive strain. He could access information from the Progenitor archives not by searching for it, but simply by knowing it was there, the knowledge unfolding in his mind like a flower reaching for the sun. He was no longer just learning, he was remembering on a cellular level. The Xylosian technology, which had once seemed impossibly advanced, now felt clumsy and loud to his senses, its inner workings laid bare to him with a mere thought. He could sense the minute emotional fluctuations of the silver-skinned beings around him through the psionic static of their ship's environment, an empathic radar he was still learning to control. He was evolving, shedding his human limitations not through study, but through an awakening of a legacy sleeping in his DNA. Seeking a moment of solitude, he found the Xylosian commander on the observation deck, staring out at the streaking stars of warp travel. Marcus stood beside him in silence for a long moment, the hum of the ship a symphony only he could fully appreciate. "I can feel it," he finally said, his voice quieter, more resonant than it had been before. "The ship's heartbeat, the flow of data through its core. I can sense the anxiety in your engineering team 2 decks below because their reactor output has a nervous flutter." He turned to the commander, and for the first time, the alien saw not just a human or a progenitor's heir, but something new. Marcus's eyes held a depth of perception that was unsettling, as if he could see the very thoughts forming in the Xylosian's mind. "The irony is not lost on me," Marcus confessed, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. "You captured me because your people feared what humanity might become if we ever regained our birthright. You saw our violence and worried it would be amplified by progenitor technology." He looked down at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. "And now I am becoming precisely what you feared. I am the fusion of human will and progenitor power. I hold capabilities I don't fully understand, abilities that could effortlessly dominate this ship, your people, perhaps even entire worlds if I so chose." The truth of it hung in the air between them, a terrifying admission of potential. The commander remained silent, its large black eyes watching him, waiting for the judgment it feared was coming. But Marcus's next words were not a declaration of dominion, they were a vow. "But your fear was based on a fundamental misreading of our nature," he stated, his voice firming with conviction. "You saw our aggression and missed our resilience. You saw our divisions and overlooked our capacity for compassion. These gifts awakening within me, they are a responsibility, not a weapon. A duty, not a right." He met the commander's gaze, his expression one of solemn, unshakable resolve. "I will not use this to dominate, I will use it to protect. To protect your people from the consequences of their past, to protect my people from the overwhelming weight of this new power, and to protect both our species from whatever else is waiting for us out there in the dark." In that moment, Marcus Thorne fully shed his identity as a soldier and embraced a new, far more complex role. He was no longer just a key or a judge. He had become the guardian of the legacy, the first sentinel in a new age, a human soul learning to steer the unimaginable power of a god. The silence that followed the establishment of the Terran coalition was not the quiet of peace, but the focused stillness before a leap into the unknown. The discovery of the progenitors' true history, not as detached gods but as agonized shepherds, and the emerging, chilling evidence of a threat that had driven them to self-imposed exile, had fundamentally altered the equation. Humanity and the Xylosians now shared a terrifying secret. The galaxy was not a quiet, empty frontier waiting for exploration. It was a garden that had been carefully and sometimes harshly tended for millennia, and the original gardeners had fled from something that might still be out there. In the face of this profound uncertainty, the new allies knew that continuing to operate in the shadows as the Xylosians had for centuries was no longer an option. Secrecy had been a strategy of fear. The new era demanded a declaration of intent. The decision to send a broadcast was not made lightly. For weeks, the combined councils of Earth and the Xylosian conclave debated the content, the timing, and the monumental risks. Some argued for caution, for sending silent probes to map the local galactic neighborhood before announcing their presence to any potential listener. Others, led by Ambassador Marcus Thorne, made a more compelling case. We stand on the shoulders of giants who chose to hide. He argued before the assembly, his words carrying the weight of his newfound connection to the progenitor legacy. Their strategy bought them time, but in the end, it only delayed the inevitable and left them isolated and afraid. We have a chance to do something different. We can choose connection over isolation. We can replace their final silence with a new opening chord. And so, from a specially constructed facility built into the lunar far side, leveraging the moon's natural mass as a shield and amplifier, the most powerful transmission in human history was sent screaming into the void. It was not a simple radio wave. It was a multi-spectrum pulse, a complex data package woven from every communication medium the two species had mastered. From electromagnetic waves to subtle subspace harmonics, and even a foundational psionic carrier wave, designed to be comprehensible to any form of advanced consciousness. The message itself was a masterpiece of interspecies diplomacy. It began with simple mathematical constants, the hydrogen line, prime numbers, the geometric purity of a circle, a universal language of introduction. This was followed by a condensed history, not of conquest but of rediscovery, images of Earth and Xylos, of humans and Xylosians working side by side in the lunar archive, and the symbol of the new Terran coalition. The heart of the transmission, the segment that would be analyzed and debated on 1,000 worlds, was a voiceover delivered by Marcus. His words were translated into the core concepts of the message itself, becoming pure meaning. People of the stars, the transmission announced, the sentiment echoing across the light years. We are the children of Terra and the heirs of Xylos, united in a new fellowship. We emerge from our solitude not as conquerors but as kin. We have learned the lessons of our shared past, the burdens of judgment, the loneliness of absolute power. That age is over. The transmission pulsed with a final, defining declaration, a promise sent like an arrow into the heart of the galaxy. We extend the hand of partnership to all species. Judgment belongs to our past, cooperation is our future. Then, humanity and the Xylosians did the only thing they could do. They waited. The silence that followed was heavier than any that had come before. Days turned into weeks. Doubts began to creep into the mission control centers on Luna and Xylos. Had the message been too naive? Had they just painted a target on their backs for every predatory empire or paranoid civilization within range of the broadcast? The tension was a physical presence in the rooms where diplomats and scientists gathered, watching the silent monitors. The first response was not what anyone expected. It did not come as a structured message or a reciprocal data packet. It arrived as a single, coherent energy signature that simply appeared on the edge of the Sol system's Oort cloud, a ripple in space-time that registered on Progenitor designed sensors long before any human or Xylosian technology would have noticed it. It was not hostile, it was a presence, a gentle ping against the windowpane of their reality, as if something was politely clearing its throat. Before the combined command could even formulate a response, a second signal arrived, this one from the opposite side of the galactic core, a complex series of quantum fluctuations that resolved into a perfect, beautiful fractal pattern, an unmistakable sign of intelligence, though its meaning was utterly opaque. Then the floodgates opened. Over the next 48 hours, the listening posts were inundated, a gravimetric pulse from a red dwarf system 20 light-years away, a modulated neutrino stream from a neutron star binary, a burst of information encoded in the differential rotation of a galactic vortex. They were not all friendly. One transmission was a blistering wave of static and rage, a warning shriek that overloaded receivers and spoke of ancient, bitter hatreds. Another was a cold, logical dissection of the broadcast's content, pointing out 17 potential logical fallacies in the concept of universal partnership before abruptly terminating. But for every hostile or analytical response, there were others that were curious, hopeful, even joyful. A species of aquatic beings from a water world transmitted a symphony of pressure wave harmonies that translated into a feeling of profound, hopeful curiosity. Another, a civilization living in the dense atmosphere of a gas giant, sent complex chemical formulas that were, upon decoding, recipes for a form of celebration. The silence was broken. The void was not empty. It was teeming with life, with history, with countless stories waiting to be heard. The Terran Coalition was no longer just a pact between two species. It had become a new focal point in a galaxy that had been waiting, either in fear or in hope, for a sign that the age of silent, lonely judgment was finally over. The work of building that future, of turning a declaration into a reality, had just begun, and the first conversations with a galaxy of strangers were about to unfold. The first true test of the Terran Coalition's principles did not arrive as a diplomatic communique or a request for aid, but as a wave of brutal, targeted destruction. The Gorantar, a fiercely militant species whose empire was built on conquest and resource extraction, had long viewed the Xylosians as fragile intellectuals ripe for subjugation. With their advanced sensor nets detecting unusual energy signatures and fleet movements from a key Xylosian agricultural colony in the Cygnus sector, they saw not a new alliance but a moment of vulnerability. Their attack was swift and merciless. A fleet of jagged, asteroid-like warships emerged from warp, their opening salvo not aimed at military installations, but at the planet's life-sustaining orbital mirrors and water purification facilities. Their objective was not defeat, it was societal collapse, a calculated act of terror designed to force immediate and total surrender. Aboard the Coalition Command Vessel Unity, the alarms were a stark, shrill contrast to the theoretical debates of the preceding weeks. Real-time tactical feeds showed the Gorantar bombardment carving fiery scars across the colony's surface. The Xylosian commanders on the bridge, their silver faces etched with a horror born from millennia of pacifism, advocated for a defensive posture, for retreating behind a shield wall and opening negotiations. Their instinct was to outthink the problem, to de-escalate, but the human admirals, their instincts honed in 100 historical conflicts, saw the immediate, brutal calculus. Negotiation with a predator at the moment of its attack is not diplomacy, it is surrender. A new, third voice was needed. That voice was Marcus Thorne. He had been mediating a trade conference in a nearby system when the distress call shattered the calm. Now, standing on the bridge of the Unity, he did not look like a traditional fleet commander. He wore the simple, dark uniform of the Coalition ambassador, but his presence commanded the room. The faint, ethereal glow of Progenitor interface data flickered in his eyes as he connected directly to the fleet's tactical network. In an instant, he processed the situation with a clarity that was almost supernatural. He saw the Gorantar fleet not just as a collection of ships, but as a single organism with a head, limbs, and a nervous system. He perceived the subtle lag in their command ship's response time. the predictable firing patterns of their spinal-mounted cannons, the blind spot in their rear defensive screens. This was no longer a military engagement. It was a game of chess, and he could see 10 moves ahead. All vessels, this is Ambassador Thorne assuming tactical command. His voice was calm, a rock in a churning sea of panic. Xylosian science ships, deploy your gravimetric distortion fields in a layered pattern. Coordinates transmitting now. Do not target their ships, target the empty space around them. Human corvettes flank at these vectors, but hold your fire. I repeat, hold your fire. The orders were unorthodox, counterintuitive to both species' doctrines. Yet the authority in his voice brooked no debate. The combined fleet moved as one. What followed was not a battle, it was a masterclass in tactical dominance. The Xylosian ships, their technology focused on energy manipulation and sensor dampening, created a cascading series of gravity wells and sensor ghosts that disoriented the Gorantar fleet. Their targeting systems locked onto phantoms. Their warships were nudged gently but insistently off course, their formations breaking down into chaos. The human vessels, meanwhile, executed lightning-fast maneuvers, positioning themselves with surgical precision at the Gorantar's most vulnerable points, their engine exhausts, their weapon magazines, their bridge viewports. Their weapons remained cold, but the threat was palpable, a blade held at the throat without drawing blood. The Gorantar found themselves completely neutralized, their mighty fleet rendered a confused, impotent herd, surrounded by a predator that refused to pounce. The Gorantar command ship, a brutish slab of metal and rage, hung dead in space, its weapons systems locked down by a dozen targeting solutions. A channel was forced open. The face that appeared on screen was a testament to a harsh evolution. Thick, rocky hide, eyes like burning coals, and a mouth full of crystalline shards that served as teeth. The warlord snarled, expecting to see the face of his Xylosian counterpart, ready to spit curses at a weakling who had won through trickery. Instead, he found himself staring at the calm, unnerving visage of Marcus Thorne. You hide behind illusions and human tricks, the warlord roared, his voice a grating avalanche of sound. Face us in honest combat. Marcus regarded him not with anger, but with a profound, almost pitying stillness. Honest combat, he replied, his voice quiet yet carrying immense weight. You attack a civilian target to provoke a response. That is not honor, that is terrorism. We could have obliterated your fleet the moment you entered the system. Your ships are still intact because we chose restraint over retaliation. He leaned slightly forward, and the warlord, to his own astonishment, felt an instinctual urge to recoil. Your people value strength above all else, so understand this. True strength is not the capacity to destroy. It is the will to show mercy when total victory is in your grasp. He let the silence hang, allowing the humiliated warlord to feel the full weight of his absolute defeat. There were no boasts, no demands for surrender. There was only a statement of fact and an offer of a new paradigm. The age of empires built on the bones of others is over, Marcus stated. The Gorantar are a strong species. Your resolve, your unity, could be a great asset to this galaxy. You have a choice. You can join this coalition. You can help build something greater than any one world or species could achieve alone. Or you can stand aside, but know this with absolute certainty. His eyes hardened, and for a split second, the warlord felt he was staring into the heart of a star, witnessing a power so vast it could unmake him without a thought. You will not threaten our people again. This is not a warning from a conqueror. It is a promise from a guardian. The transmission ended, leaving the warlord alone on his bridge, his certainty shattered, his definition of strength forever rewritten. The first test was over, and a new standard for galactic conduct had been decisively set.